want to test if one thing works. Oh. So I see the after 1 o'clock, so we should start the broadcast. Okay, well, welcome everybody. This is the, I guess, third webinar that we've done out of the Technology and Social Change Research Project here at Harvard Kennedy's Shorenstein Center. A pretty special panel, so I do want to go over some housekeeping, and then I'll introduce all of our panelists, and we're going to be talking today about democracy during a pandemic. So it's going to be a pretty interesting conversation. So I'm going to share my screen here and get that rolling, and then presenter mode. Here we go. Okay. So briefly, today we're going, the housekeeping is audio and video have been turned off. This is a webinar broadcast, and unfortunately, due to some of the security concerns around Zoom, we're not going to be able to use more of the interactive features. And the public chat has also been disabled. To ask a question, please use the Q&A feature. And for technical issues, please privately chat with Schwartz. And note, today we're adding another technological layer to the conversation. We have the WGBH Forum Network live streaming this to a wider audience. And so if you do see the tweets on WGBH, please share them with your network. And a matter of course, we are going to talk a bit today about democracy, but generally the Technology and Social Change Research Project has a few different objectives. We're located at the Shorenstein Center, and we generally analyze how media manipulation is a means to control public conversation, derail democracy, and disrupt society. And we are building a large casebook of 100 case studies of media manipulation And we're thinking this is a contribution to public literacy about media manipulation, political polarization, and information systems. Today's speakers, I am so excited that they agreed to join us. I am Joan Donovan, Research Director at the Shorenstein Center. We are joined with Nancy Gibbs, the director of the Shorenstein Center and former editor-in-chief of Time magazine. She has over 47 cover stories and is gearing up for a really important and timely interview through Time that you all should check out later this weekend or next week when it gets published. We also have Rob Faris, who is a co-author of one of the most important books on network propaganda and the 2016 US elections. He's a senior researcher here at Shorenstein Center. And Setti Warren is the executive director of the Shorenstein Center, affectionately known around our parts as the mayor of Shorenstein. And he's the former mayor of Newton, Massachusetts, and has been working diligently to help organize alongside physicians and other public officials how governance and public policy should handle the COVID-19 crisis. And so I'm very excited to have everybody here today, and I'm going to shut off the screen share so that we can just see one another. And today, I think I want to open with a little bit of a broad question just about your, like, where you're at, what's happening, what things are piquing your interest, what have you been looking at? You know, from your perspective, how is COVID-19 changing the day-to-day, either within journalism or within policy and governorship, and of course, across our information system? So Nancy, if you'd like to talk a bit about some of the broader trends that you're seeing, I'd like you to start first.
Thanks, Joan. You know, the thing I'm most interested in right now is this crisis as the latest occasion for journalists to have to revisit the rules they operate by in real time and under pressure. And you can say a lot of things about our politics in the last 4 years has had that effect as well, but nothing like this crisis. And let me give you an example. It was a pretty hard and fast rule at Time when we were writing about health issues, which were routinely some of the most popular, high traffic, high readership topics we covered, that we would not write about anything that had not been peer reviewed. That was just the obvious gold standard, that we would never be writing about a promising treatment or breakthrough or development in health if it had not gone through all of the rigors of the peer review process. Now we're in an atmosphere in which, understandably, the hunger for hope and for information is such that the coverage of preprints has just gone through the roof. And on the one hand, I understand why that is. On the other hand, it also helps explain why the WHO is talking about an infodemic, that you have so much information flooding people who are hungry for it. And some of it's true and some of it's not. And most of us as civilians are not in a good position to sort it out. I think that the imperative for journalists to be really, really rigorous about their standards before they write about something, before they cover something, even if it is exciting and promising and holds out hope at a time when we want it so much, we just have to be even more mindful that unless you have had really multiple experts affirming that, yes, this is something that deserves to be covered, I'm very wary about lowering the bar too far when it comes to non-peer reviewed research. That's the thing that's front of mind now, as a really obvious, understandable tension between the people's right to know, their hunger, journalists' desire to feed that, and yet be responsible doing it.
I'd like to go to you, Setti, next, if you want to talk a bit about what's top of mind for you.
You know, thanks, Joan. What I'm really looking at and concerned about is local governance. As a mayor, and working with other mayors and county commissioners and town managers from all across the country, which I would do, we all know that local entity is the first place people go to when they need assistance for something, and they're the closest to the people. So one, I remember when I was mayor, the SARS question came about, and I was fortunate enough to have someone as a part of my staff that was an infectious disease doctor, and she was able to give me really good advice. We had a citizen that was coming to Newton that we thought had SARS coming home, so we did some pretty dramatic preparation. We work with Newton Wellesley Hospital. When I think about this pandemic, there's a lot of municipalities and county governments that don't have that kind of expertise and information so that they can be prepared. So one, our local governance, local leaders prepared? Are they armed with the kind of information about this pandemic that they need to know, and so that they can take action? Secondly, I worry very much about resources at the local level. A lot of folks are talking about the federal government right now and the stimulus package. Those are really important things, but the federal government can run deficits. Local government can't. So we're talking about funding basic services, first responders, fire and police. Are there resources at the local level? Schools, are there resources at the local level as states start to see revenue go down, cities start to see revenue go down? You know, we're really fortunate in Newton, again, unlike other communities, we depend on the property tax. We have a strong property tax base. There are a lot of communities out there that don't have a strong property tax. They depend on sales revenue. They depend on government assistance from the state. So that's a real concern of mine, and I think we have to look at it. And then lastly, this issue of elections. I know there are a lot of questions about it. Implementing elections. You know, when I ran for mayor at the local level, I had zero name ID. I wasn't going to raise $1 million to go on television. I had to knock on doors and meet people. And I won my first election by a really close margin, but I wouldn't have been able to compete in this environment at all. And that's one. Two, for candidates that are running, there's a lot of questions about signatures they have to get on the ballot. 3 months ago, these campaigns had plans at the local level, at the state level, to collect signatures. You can't stand in front of Shaw's Market to get signatures, right? So there's a lot of candidates out there that are running here in Massachusetts that are challenged because they may not meet the deadline. And then lastly, voting. I am very concerned about access to the polls. I'm concerned about what we saw in Wisconsin at the local level. One of the things that happened in Massachusetts that was terrific, our Secretary of State essentially said, you know, we're gonna take absentee ballot to another level. We're gonna say, you know, not just we're allowing absentee ballot, not just because you have a disability or you're not physically here in the state. He said, if you're worried about contracting COVID-19, we're going to extend mail-in ballot access to you. So that was a really good, quick move that the secretary made. I worry about other states, and I worry about that ballot access. We just saw what happened in Wisconsin. So those are the things I've been thinking about.
I keep muting myself and then I forget to unmute. It's classic. So Rob, you've been studying quite a bit of the COVID-19 misinformation environment, and I'm interested to hear from you, what are some of the things that are, you know, really top interests or important things that you've started to consider related to your research?
Thank you, Joan. I'm thrilled to be here with you all as ever. I'm looking at the way media and disinformation and media manipulation is shaping public discourse, and I'm thinking about this at two different levels. There's been a lot of writing about the tremendous flow of disinformation across the internet through various platforms and means, and that is certainly a very, very serious problem, most acute in fringe communities online. And I think it's going to be a long time before we fully understand the full implications and impact of that. A greater preoccupation for me is how this informs and intersects with large media, particularly partisan media. It's going to be too soon also to really draw firm conclusions on this. But I think the level of damage done by large media in certainly in the United States, I'm not sure I can speak to other places around the world, is going to be larger than the more acute forms of disinformation you see in fringe media. The principal problem here being where partisan media, particularly in conservative media, dominates the media sphere, and how partisanship in media gets in the way of truth and accuracy in reporting. I think many of us may have hoped that a pandemic of this seriousness and this scope would have transcended both politics and partisanship, and kind of like burst through that bubble. There are certainly promising signs of that. The actions of citizens around the world are transcending politics in many ways. The thing that I find most worrisome is, particularly amongst those in power, is that politics and partisanship continues to rule the day, even at the detriment of public health. And that's what worries me.
Yeah, I've been really preoccupied with the of both the science and the politics of chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine, and when politicians interject and intervene in the scientific discourse, and how that attention to one of the many drugs that are on clinical trials right now is shaping what Nancy was talking about around people really wanting hope. And I think that when we see misinformation scale in different ways, or not just even misinformation, but just uncertain information, we do see politicians vying to show control, right? Because that's what governance is, by and large, is social control. And but this past week has been really challenging for all of the reasons that Setti has laid out, where Wisconsin did try to run a primary in this moment. And we saw that some polls were shut down. We saw that some information online was, people were having trouble figuring out where to vote, how to vote, if they could vote mail in and late. And subsequently after this, we did see Bernie Sanders back out of the campaign, and we decided to change our Me More Weekly newsletter to really be about the Bernie Sanders memes at that time, just to get a sense of what people were concerned about. And so let's switch to thinking a little bit about the voting process right now, disruptions to the voting process. Of course, many of our friends in civil society, especially our affiliate fellow researcher Brandy Collins Dexter at Color of Change, has been thinking about different voter suppression efforts. And part of it was, we had been doing a lot of research on trying to understand different techniques for voter suppression that were going to show up in our digital world. But now we're also starting to think through, how might COVID-19 complicate approaches to voting? And Nancy, I'm going to go to you, because I really want to understand more about how journalists might even try to cover something like a local election, given how disruptive COVID-19 is to their normal working process.
I mean, I think this is going to be just a huge, huge, huge challenge for news organizations at every level. On the one hand, just to take a step back, I think many of us, if you are not a complete political junkie, it would be entirely natural to feel that our presidential campaigns last way too long, cost way too much. And the idea of having a dramatically compressed calendar that doesn't look anything like the kind of years-long process that we've had in recent cycles might come as a huge relief to people. So the fact that we have no idea how this campaign's going to unfold, will there be live conventions or not? Setti talked about door knocking. Think about all of the parts of a normal campaign that journalists would be covering that require being in contact with people, the fundraisers, the rallies, the conventions themselves. And so if we don't know yet if some or all of that is off the table, people have speculated what it will mean if the Democrats, having postponed their convention in Milwaukee by 5 weeks, if they decided it was not prudent to hold it, but the Republicans went ahead and held theirs. What would the optics of that be? Does that look like one brave party and one cowardly party, one dumb party and one smart party? How do those decisions get processed? So we are in such unmapped territory in how this is going to work, that journalists, I think, have to be even more vigilant than normal about not playing into narratives that are going to have the effect of making people less likely to vote, less likely to pay attention. You have tracked, and we all have seen, how even the rumor of a voting disruption can have the effect. You don't actually have to take out all the traffic lights in a downtown area. You just have to have there be a rumor that the traffic lights all went down, or that there was a shooting near a polling station, or any number of ways in which bad actors have used misinformation to try to deter people from actually coming out and voting. Now, you don't even need the bad actors when you've got a highly contagious virus doing the work for you. So, as with so many things that this crisis has accelerated, including the fact that we are now all becoming much more familiar with virtual ways of convening and communicating, whether this actually is what it takes to accelerate what was a necessary movement anyway of access to the ballot, of making mail-in voting easier, voter registration easier, early voting easier, all of the different ways in which it would have been healthy for democracy to provide easier ballot access under normal times, becomes actually a life and death issue in these times. And so I don't see a bigger issue when it comes to the legal and political fights that are going to be unfolding at every level than this one.
Have you seen anything like this in your, during your career? You've covered different campaigns. You've been sort of close to the metal in terms of being even on board the buses and traveling with candidates. Have you ever seen, or even on a small scale, a disruption of this magnitude where, that people don't know where to vote, that of course, there's going to have to be, really in the moment decision making that could potentially change outcomes?
I have not seen anything like this. The only thing that is anywhere in the ballpark was, of course, what we all lived through in 2000 with Florida, which was a huge national masterclass in the fact that our elections are messy. And, because it isn't just that you've got 50 states running their own elections, you've got something like 5,000 different authorities that are making rules. And in some ways that has provided a certain amount of security. It isn't like there's one electoral system for a bad actor to hack. But what we saw in Florida in 2000 was that, a badly designed ballot in Palm Beach combined with, malfunctioning voting machines in a northern county, combined with with the fact that it was simply a very, very close vote. We aren't engineered for exact precision in our voting or our vote counting. It didn't matter until we had an effective tie. And that was in an even far less polarized environment than now. And so the thing I worry about most, and that I think journalists who are covering this have to be really mindful of, are going to be efforts that we're seeing even now to preemptively delegitimize the results.
Interesting. Setti, Rob, do either of you want to jump in on lessons potentially learned from 2000? I was, I at that time in 2000, I was very young and was in Times Square one afternoon, going to a concert that evening in New York City. And a few of my friends bumped into a very large protest, a recount protest demanding that the results be true and correct and remeasured. And I think this speaks to the sort of sociology of the situation, where every sociologist knows counting things is hard. It's really hard. It's really hard to do well, and we need to build in margins of error. But when things are close, like an election, of course, you do get civil unrest. And I'm wondering if you two have any reflections on that point.
Rob, do you want to step in? I don't want to.
Sure, you can clean up if I make a mess of this. So I mean, the way I'm thinking about it, I don't think that we have prospectively gone into an election with so much uncertainty about people's ability to vote, and probably since the civil rights era or before. And so I think it's very different from 2000, in which we came out of the process and we're trying to figure out how can we both get it right in a way that the public can agree upon and maintain a sense of legitimacy in the election, which far from perfect, but we kind of made it through that. This has the potential, I think, to be a wedge issue in the campaign itself. And I don't know of that being as strong in the past for a very, very long time. And it will at some point help one side versus the other. Probably too soon to know that, but I think in our divisive campaign, in the deep polarization and partisanship that we've been experiencing, which gets worse over time, I think this exacerbates that. And the question becomes, how do we come out the other side? So looking back in December 2020, where do we stand as a nation? Are we more fractured than we are now? And if so, what does that mean? Where do we go from there?
Yeah, I agree with Rob. I just add, we should keep an eye on the governors right now to help answer the election question in November. Why am I saying that? You still have governors out there saying that we can open up now, or have not issued stay at home. The governor of Florida is talking about opening up certain parts of the state and closing certain parts of the state. He was quoted yesterday as saying that young people, we're going to send kids back to school, young kids don't get this virus. So I think that, and then on the other hand, you have Governor Gavin Newsom last night, who's using the terminology nation state to describe the state of California. I say all this because from the beginning of this conversation we started, and Nancy pointed this out, each of the states have their own decisions to make around voting. And each of the states are making decisions around whether they're going to keep things closed or open. So I suspect that those decisions, the decisions that are happening now, and decisions about who gets to, who physically goes to the polls, who stays home, could affect turnout in different communities, racial, rural, urban. I mean, you could have scenarios where governors are making deliberate decisions to help the president or not. So I think we got to keep a close eye on the governors around the elections. And I also want to just say, there are just huge economic disparities that have been a part of our country for so long. And all this is doing, this virus is exposing those. And so this is another problem and challenge we have, particularly the governors, state and local, as these disparities around health, whether it's race, whether it's people being able to work or not. This also, I think, could have a factor in the fall elections and could factor into people's behavior in those fall elections.
Yeah, and I want to say next week's Big If True webinar is going to be mostly about race, xenophobia, and COVID-19. And we do have the reporters from ProPublica who've been writing some of the most in-depth research on health disparities and race and how different people are going to die in different proportions as a result of poor service delivery. And the question still remains, how is misinformation also going to play into the ways in which people seek care? And so we're going to be discussing a lot of that next week. But I do want to pick up a bit on the light bulb moment from Rob here about the challenges we might want to look back at the civil rights era in the ways in which we had to overcome different blockades and voter suppression efforts that were targeting specifically Black communities, and of course there was legislation that had to be put in place so that voting could happen and that there could be accountability. And Setti, I want to ask you potentially, is there some kind of rule or loophole or something that we should start to advocate for now that would empower governors or a governance structure to ensure the expansion of what Nancy's pointing to of mail-in ballots, absentee ballots, so that we can shore up that the most people that are eligible to vote can vote in the national election and in local elections?
Yes, so this is grassroots organizing, Joan, and every elected official that sees a large number of citizens, people from civil society, people that are their constituents, they listen. And so, and I've just seen this recently. I mean, here in Massachusetts, this group of medical professionals that I've been helping who were concerned that the governor had not put in place stay at home, put a letter together, petition, and they got over 1,000 signatures asking the governor, and he's been great and responsive, but before he had closed, to do stay at home and take some other measures to help get PPE to health professionals. And I think that helped. I think the governor listened. It wasn't, I don't think that was the only thing he listened to, but I think it did help. So I think
that made me think about, one of the big challenges in social movements right now has been the digitization of certain tactics has made those tactics almost useless. Like we've really automated the petition process, online. And as a result, if you get 200, signatures, it doesn't really matter. And if you get 2,000, great. But maybe there is a potential to bring back the petition, especially if you can get certain constituencies like health professionals to gather and make collective recommendations.
Yes. And I think if you can also not work with other organizations that are like-minded as well. I think this group, the COVID-19 Action Advocacy Group in Massachusetts, is trying to do that as well. So that's right, Joe. I think that's exactly right.
Yeah, and I think the coalition building has to happen right now. And I do see, privacy groups starting to get into alignment around asks from tech companies, and the voting advocacy groups are definitely trying to understand what is the potential ask right now. And so we are going to be thinking on that quite a bit. And we also rely, I think, in advocacy circles on journalists to get, the word out. And we've seen journalists right now are really stretched to their limits, right? They're stuck in their homes. They're trying to get information out. They're getting tips, but it's really difficult to verify information right now. And I want to talk a bit about the role that misinformation might play in impacting voter turnout. And as a team, you know, we've been talking about different kinds of misinformation. Is it going to be, you know, are there going to be just conspiracy theories, right? Like there's the fringe that are about, you know, this COVID-19 is a bioweapon engineered to X, Y, and Z, targeting very specific populations. There's others that are, you know, uncertainty that are going to drive misinformation about the way that COVID-19 spreads. For instance, there was a Medium post that went out saying that, you know, joggers might end up, you know, spraying more residual droplets of their sweat and their breath as they run past other people. This Medium post was couched as a study, but Vice has come back and refuting it, saying that this study isn't quite a study. And so, as Nancy was saying earlier, we might have misunderstandings or blatant disinformation play a role in how people think the disease might be infecting other people. So I wanted to ask what kinds of misinformation might be the ones to look out for in terms of impacting voter turnout. And I'm thinking here, it might actually change the polling stations, it might change the process, but it also might downstream lead to voter apathy. Anybody, I'll kick it open if anybody has any thoughts on that.
Well, the only thing I would say, the obvious piece of this is that on the one hand, it's easy to see why our processes need to change, because the idea of large-scale in-person voting may make no sense. On the other hand, the minute you introduce changes, you open a door for mischief and for, you know, for mischievous social media messaging that targets people saying, you know, be sure that you vote on Wednesday, November, whatever, of the kind that we've seen before. You have more room to confuse people about where and when and how they should vote if you're changing any of those things. So that's just, you know, we've set the environment where there's already the potential for confusion.
I'd like to follow up on what Nancy's saying. I think that's really smart. And I think the other piece to this that I worry about is that our voting systems were not that robust to begin with. And when you start layering on levels of risk into things, it just complicates things that much farther. So should there be a cybersecurity incident on top of rumors floating around about the safety of going to the voting booth, those things will just compound one another. And I'm not sure we're prepared for that.
Setti, did you want to chime in about particular, you know, any kinds of misinformation, or even if there's something from your past in the different campaigns that you've been on? I remember we talked a bit about swift voting and how you've, you know, seen some of this close up.
Yeah, no, I traveled with Senator Kerry as a strip director through the 2004 campaign. And of course, there was a ton of misinformation. Swift vote was an example of that leading into Election Day. And, you know, Senator Kerry,
can you explain what that is, just so that everybody's on the same page?
There was, during the campaign, there was a third-party group that essentially came out and said Senator Kerry had lied about earning various medals that he did earn. He made things up to get those medals, and he really wasn't a war hero. And they were pushing this in the spring of 2004 and continued to push it. I think, you know, Senator Kerry has acknowledged publicly that he wished he had pushed back harder earlier on it, because the information spread all the way through. And by the time he firmly addressed it, it sort of had baked into the psychology of the voters. But I think there is a real danger. One of the things I was thinking about, Joan, is maybe having governors and mayors somehow play as a clearinghouse, almost stand up, what's real, what's not real in state and local elections, leading into the election and then election day. People still, all the surveys say, people still trust their local officials the most in government. So there's some real foundation there that local officials have with voters and citizens. So these are the types of new things I think we need to be thinking about, particularly at the local level where people are closest to the voters and the people they serve.
It's a really good point, because one of the things that I've been writing about, thinking about, especially with what Nancy was saying about the opportunities posed by change, right? And so we know that in Iowa, there was a total cascade of misinformation due to the changes in the technical system, not necessarily with the voting apparatus, but in the counting apparatus. And that opened up lots of opportunities for dangerous speculation. And we saw some of us who had been up late into the night, even allegations about other people at HKS even being part of some kind of plot to change the voting outcomes. And so this kind of problem predates, of course, the pandemic, right? And the pandemic poses then new challenges for people encountering misinformation. So especially the WHO's concept of an infodemic, which is this idea that there's an overabundance of information. It's hard to tell what's true and what's not true at this stage. That, compounded by the opportunities posed by changes to the where, when, and how of voting, could lead to lots of misinformation and open up disinformation possibilities. Gabby Lim and I also recently wrote a piece in Slate about the white propaganda war going on between the US and China related to explanations about a responsibility around COVID-19. And we can imagine that this will also mutate and change as we see other state actors entering into the social media space and trying to sway public opinion. One of the things, though, that I'm thinking through as we talk here is that several of the Silicon Valley companies, Facebook, Twitter, Google, Microsoft, have put out a joint statement saying that they are going to fight misinformation. They're going to surface authoritative content, and they are going to work with health agencies to provide information for people. And I've written a little bit about how to do some of this using repurposing social media advertising systems that do try to give people the right information at the right time, in the right moment. And so I'm trying to think about, if we do all of this work to shore up that governors are the ones that are delivering the information and getting the recommendations out there, health professionals and are making recommendations and getting people the best information that they can about what COVID-19 is and how it's spread. If those groups are then coordinating with election officials across each state so that election officials are primed for understanding the impact of COVID-19, we still are left with sort of the fatal flaw of our information system that we've been studying, which is that if the platform companies do not change their systems, all of this falls apart if people can't get access to the right information in a timely, relevant, and local way. And so I'm thinking here about, is there a way or how are you all thinking about in your domain, how journalists might come at this problem of getting timely, relevant local information to people, given the fact that it might not be a perfect system, but are there other mechanisms or other ways that they might want to communicate with the public? I'm thinking here, Setti, too, about governors. I've been, the Cuomo briefings that have been aired on television, people from all over tuning into those. Baker has had several, press conferences from the government center. How should we think about overcoming the infodemic from your perspectives? Nancy, I'll start with you.
Well, I'm struck by the painful irony that we are seeing in these last couple of weeks, a huge spike in audience for local news sources, which the research has fairly consistently showed are among the most trusted news sources. Even when people hate the national media, they still like their local television or their local newspaper. So at exactly the moment, these local sources that have the access and the trust that allows them to deliver reliable information, that happens exactly the time that they're getting gutted by a business model that's collapsing even faster than it had been. And so I think it's a really significant problem now that the local news ecosystem is so endangered when it's needed most. And you're going to see, I will predict, an acceleration too of the debate over how to fund, what the platform company's responsibility is, whether there should be public funding. There's already a debate about whether newsrooms should be taking federal money as part of the stimulus packages. What's the role for nonprofits? What's the role of public media? We're researching a lot of this at the Shorenstein Center. That conversation is only going to accelerate because this is where people want to get their news. And we can try every way we can to bolster those local newsrooms and help make sure that they have access to the expertise that they need to do a good job right now. But boy, it's hard when they're having to lay people off and they're seeing their budgets being slashed to the bone.
Yeah, I agree with you. And, people, if you're listening, Elizabeth Hansen's work at the Shorenstein Center has really been, showing us how the different business models for news organizations really impacts the quality and their ability to do good investigative and independent pieces. And that's something we haven't talked a lot about yet on this webinar series, but I'm really excited to think through what independence really means and why we need it in all of our different sectors. And collaboration shouldn't be beholden to funding streams, for instance. Setti, any thoughts on how other ways that governors or health professionals might communicate during this time, given that it's so hard to get information through the social media system?
Well, we're fortunate here in Massachusetts because we have so many leading medical experts and healthcare professionals, and I think we're incredibly fortunate. So I know the governor's team has been in touch with a lot of different people in Massachusetts, and I know that mayors are speaking to one another. I spoke with the mayor of Newton recently, and I also spoke with the governor. There just needs to be increased coordination between healthcare officials, elected officials, and then elected officials need to talk to one another, because one of the other observations that I've had, and I think that's starting to happen nationally, one of the observations I've had is that one county official may have one piece of information, and the next county over, or the next city over, or the next town over, they have another piece of information, and they're working off of different facts. So I think communication between government entities and elected leaders is just as important as them talking to healthcare professionals.
Yeah, and that's always been a challenge, is the internal, external optimizing of communications. And I agree with you that we have to think of both systems. Earlier this week I was on a webinar series with the WHO they were trying to do just that. They were trying to bridge journalists with academia, with industry. But the problem still remained is that every once in a while, someone would make this recommendation that you just go on, a health professional, just go on Twitter and start tweeting about it. And it's just like, health professionals are not influencers. Last night, one of the most interesting interviews I've seen in a while between Anderson Cooper and Magic Johnson. Anderson Cooper asked Magic Johnson about the misinformation question. And Magic Johnson said, we have all this technology. We have all these different ways of communicating with one another. It should be easy to give information and receive information. However, the information is being circulated by people with big followers. And so, Rob, I want to ask you a bit about influence. And you had talked at the beginning a bit about large news organizations and the kind of impact they have on potentially spreading misinformation. And I'm seeing a few questions here about the dominance of Sinclair and local TV as well. And I'm not asking you to make any specific insights about that frame, but I do want to know, as we start to see that there's a huge value in getting access and giving information through local news networks, we have experts that are completely challenged by the social media aspect of this. And then you have large news organizations that are, for instance, airing President Trump live every night at 6 p.m. And he's, just started laying the groundwork for people to not believe mail-in ballots recently. That to me was really concerning. And I'm wondering from your perspective, how should we adapt, or how might we adapt to this? And what role do these large organizations play in influencing our ability to know and to trust, in this case, the voting apparatus and the voting process?
So that's a really good, hard question, Joan. I think you already know I'm better at diagnosing the problem than I am at figuring out how to fix it. What we're dealing with are media ecosystems with a political bias and deeply held polarization that are run many decades deep. They have cultural, economic roots, and I think unraveling that is the challenge of our time. So I don't know how to do that. I can say that these problems predated the internet, and a lot of people are apt to both point the blame for disinformation on digital media sources and place also undue hope in fixing these by fixing digital technologies. And that's wrong. There's the good people fighting the good fight of whack-a-mole online, and God bless them. They need more time, they need more resources. You, Joan, have written very eloquently of the challenges of moderation and the shortcomings, as well as kind of the inherent inability of social medias to police their own platforms. I think what we do know works and can do more of is amplifying and elevating experts at this time. So we need more Dr. Fauci and less Alex Jones. And journalists can play a big part in that. I know they have their hands full and they're doing the best they can, but this is something they do and they do very well. And I think doubling down on that will be very, very important in the coming months.
Joan, can I just
yeah,
comment?
Of course, always.
Two things I wanted to make a point on. One, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. One of the mistakes that were made in the early 2000s FEMA was actually a cabinet level agency. And I actually was the Region 1 New England FEMA director during the time that, under the Clinton administration, during the time FEMA was cabinet level. FEMA would take over all communication during a disaster, regionally and federally. We would coordinate getting supplies to where they needed to go. Unfortunately, the next administration put it under Homeland Security and actually put it in different sections of Homeland Security, which I think really hurt its effectiveness. Today, what you're seeing is not just the results of that, but the president has moved different people as the point person in responding to this. So down the road, I just want to flag, when someone asked a question about communication and why it's so hard for government to communicate, you know, that model that FEMA that we had was very effective in responding and communicating. So some of this is a federal question and structural question as well.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree with you. And that's something that I've been, you know, trying to, as I think about how I'm going to even approach this as someone who studies communication systems, you know, I think a lot every day about how I'm going to start my day in terms of what media I'm going to consume and where I'm going to start. And lately I've been starting with the local Boston website, the .gov on coronavirus, because I just want to know what's happening in my area, right? And so I think there are underutilized avenues for getting information out, and that we become fixated on social media being the only way forward because we are used to it and it's well practiced, but it's not always going to be the most useful in the moment, and it's not always going to tell us what we need to know, especially as cities start to implement curfews and other kinds of changes to essential services. And I wanted to close just by offering you all an opportunity to reflect on any of the themes that have come up in our conversation and just give some parting words of advice, some sage wisdom, if you could, just because it's Friday and after I sign off here, I'm gonna go play some Animal Crossing and enjoy some of the afternoon. And I really appreciate everybody's questions; they've been great. But yeah, Nancy, any parting words for people on the line?
Well, because I want to end on a hopeful note, I want to pick up on something Rob said about expertise. I had a really interesting conversation yesterday with a former network news chief about what we're seeing on television now that all the anchors are, operating from their basements and their attics and their kitchen tables, and their guests are all coming on by, WebEx or Zoom or Skype or whatever. Is that there has been a necessary trade-off in a great decrease in production values where, the lighting and the high def and the hair and makeup aren't perfect, with an explosion in access to experts, where it is so much easier now to put people who actually know what they're talking about, who are either doctors and nurses on the front lines or academics and scholars in universities, who either would not have time or would not be able to go to the studio and sit for 3 hours to be on the air for 2.5 minutes. You now have this incredible opening up of access to experience and expertise. And I think it would be a criminal loss if we did not, however this all resolves, continue down that direction. Our kids who've grown up on YouTube and TikTok are not accustomed to high production values for every piece of video that they consume. And now all of our expectations have been uniformly lowered. And yet in many cases, I think it means the quality of conversation and insight can go up, and that could be something for local news, for national news and everything in between could be a real benefit.
Amazing. Setti?
Back in 2016, I was a surrogate for Hillary Clinton, and the Clinton campaign sent me to 6 battleground states. I primarily went to Black communities and visited for a day or two and spoke. And the stories I heard were really tough about the fact that their stories weren't being told, and that the federal government needed to do more across the board. And, this terrible virus is wreaking havoc, as we all know. But one of the things that I'm now noticing in the media is that a lot of stories are being told that weren't being told before this terrible pandemic. There are a lot of stories of people that, for a lot of people, are invisible. People that in minority communities, people that work in certain jobs. So, I'm glad those stories are being told, even through this horrible, horrible, horrible thing that's happening. And I hope coming out of it, we're not just telling those stories, but we're taking policy action, taking action.
Rob?
So listening to all of you, I was thinking of the cruel ironies of this crisis is exposing areas where we really need attention right now while taking away our ability to address them. So one of them was, Joan, you were talking about the need for greater advocacy in the coming months. And one of the arrows taken out of the quiver is the ability to bring people into the streets and organize people face to face is a real challenge for that area and something we need to think long and hard about. I'm also taking away Nancy's point about the critical role of local news coming at a time where the crisis is going to be the final blow financially for so many of them, and we need to figure that out and figure it out fast. The other thing I'm thinking about is we spend so much of our time thinking at the national level in this political blood sport and almost game show context for politics and media at the national level, while so much of the good, important work is happening at the local level. I'm going to be listening to Setti a lot in the coming months and learning from him. This has been great for me. I've really appreciated being here with all of you.
No, this has been an incredible conversation, and I really appreciate seeing my coworkers and all the amazing work that you're doing. I wish we were in the office together around the ice machine. We don't have a water cooler, and discussing these issues. And I really do miss everybody dearly. And yeah, from my perspective, I think I've got a whole set of notes here, things we need to think on. And my team and I are going to be putting together a little piece for Neiman about understanding COVID-19 and voter suppression. And I really appreciate your insights today, because I think it's going to help us wrap up that piece. And then I would just want to let everybody know before we sign off that next week's panel discussion is going to be on race, xenophobia, and COVID-19. And we have me, as well as Lisa Nakamura, who's a professor that studies race and gender and the internet. We have Gabby Lim, who's a researcher on our team here at the Technology and Social Change Project. We have Talia Buford and Akila Johnson, who are the team at ProPublica that have been writing about racial disparities. And we have Martina Ecubanez, I'm really bad at pronouncing names, I apologize, who is from Asian Americans Advancing Justice. And I think that conversation next week is going to help us start to understand the edges of this problem, and to your point, Setti, get to understanding some of those stories and surfacing some of the knowledge that we need to from journalist community practitioners. So thank you, everybody, and I'll see you on the internet.
Thanks, Joan.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.